anchors, enforcers, destroyers, ball winners, deep-lying playmakers, registas, segundo volantes, and Fred. Holding midfielders come in all different shapes and sizes. In fact, it can sometimes be difficult to define them whatsoever. Andrea Pirlo and Nigel de Jong will both sometimes be described as defensive or holding midfielders, despite the fact that they could hardly be any more contrasting in terms of their styles of play and the roles that they performed. Then you have more box-to-box style midfielders like Roy Keane or Michael Essien, who perhaps dropped deeper and deeper as the years went on and did eventually become defensive midfielders, but would you define them as being central or defensive midfielders over the entire course of their careers? As you can see, it can get a whole lot messy and confusing, so you would have to be an absolute idiot to attempt to firstly define and then rank the 7 best defensive midfielders of the last 23 years. Hi, Idiot here, and that is exactly what I've done, as part of an ongoing series taking a look at some of the greatest players of the 21st century in every position. I will be making 3 midfield videos as part of this series, ranking the best defensive, central and attacking midfielders, so although it remains fairly arbitrary and you won't all agree with my categorizations I'm sure, I have set quite a high bar for being a defensive midfielder. Michael Carrick makes the cut, but Frenkie de Jong does not. John Obi Mikel fits the bill, but Andrea Pirlo will be considered for the central midfield 7. As ever, the rankings are based upon the quality and quantity of a player's performances since January 1st, 2000. Longevity alone won't get you in, but nor will an incredible peak in isolation. Fernando Redondo, Pep Guardiola, Didier Deschamps and Lothar Matthäus are among the finest holding midfielders that the game has ever seen, and all played in the 2000s. But none of them for more than a few years, and they were already well past their best, so there is no way in which they could feature. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Aurelien Tchouameni and Declan Rice, as just 2 examples, are outstanding holding midfielders, but neither have played anywhere near enough football to feature. Hopefully that all makes sense, and if not, feel free to go back to the Goalkeepers 7 where I laid out the full criteria, and enjoy this series as a whole. Without further ado then, who wasn't a defensive midfielder by any definition, here are the 7 greatest defensive midfielders, in my view, and in my view only, you will disagree, and that's a good thing, since the turn of the millennium. 7th, N'Golo Kanté. I very nearly left N'Golo Kanté out of this 7, which would have drawn the wrath of several thousand people in the comments no doubt, but I will begin by explaining why that was the case, and why he only takes 7th. Kante was 24 years old when he was spotted by Steve Walsh and signed by Leicester City, following his first ever season of top-flight football with Cannes in Ligue 1. Of course, Kante was superb during his sole season in Leicestershire as the single most important player, in my view at least, in the Foxes' freak Premier League title win. Kante subsequently signed for Chelsea, where he had, I would argue, 2 outstanding seasons, which were his first 2 seasons at the Bridge. You could make the case, therefore, that Kante only actually had 3 truly elite-level seasons in which he played consistent first-team football at the very highest level, which is, by some distance it should be said, the fewest of anyone in this 7, and fewer than a number of the honourable mentions that I'll come to later on. That is not to say, of course, that Kante didn't still have great games or even great runs of form post-2018 and outside of those 3 seasons. He was pivotal, for example, in both semi-finals and the final of Chelsea's 2021 Champions League win, just that from 2018 onwards, he tended to be great in patches and he had a fairly rough time with injuries. The reason why Kante still, just about, features in this 7, ahead of players with far greater longevity, is because his peak was truly phenomenal. Indeed, during those 3 years, between 2015 and 2018, Kante was arguably the single most effective midfielder on the planet, and one of the most decisive footballers in the world in terms of influencing the outcome of a game. Relentless in his running and determination to win the ball back, for a long time it was joked that Kante was like having 2 players in midfield, but it was a joke that wasn't without some merit. He may be washed up now, age 32 in Saudi Arabia, having failed to even hit double figures for appearances in a miserable campaign for Chelsea last season, but Kante's peak would put him in contention for a spot in our top 3, so he just about sneaks in at 7th. 6th, Fernandinho. Fernandinho may never have been as lauded as N'Golo Kanté was at his peak, and perhaps he never quite possessed the individual match-winning prowess that Kante did at his absolute zenith. But he was a world-class defensive midfielder for a much longer period of time. Unlike Kante, Fernandinho aged like a fine wine, actually peaking right around the age that Kante is now. A graduate of the Atletico Paranaense youth ranks, Fernandinho broke into the first team and immediately became a star man in the top flight of Brazilian football in 2003, aged only 18. His next stop, like a number of promising Brazilian youngsters when they moved to Europe, was Shakhtar Donetsk, where Fernandinho spent 8 whole years. How the Ukrainians managed to keep hold of him for quite so long is anyone's guess, and when Manchester City finally prized him from their hands in 2013, by which stage Fernandinho was 28 years old, they were forced to fork out what then looked like a fairly hefty £34 million. It proved to be an absolute bargain. Fernandinho was excellent from day one at the Etihad, lifting the Premier League title under Manuel Pellegrini during his debut campaign, but he reached yet new heights following the appointment of Pep Guardiola. Fernandinho's peak, in my view, came in the 2018-19 season when he was arguably the standout player in a Manchester City team which won 98 points. The game that season between Manchester City and Liverpool, who were neck and neck at the top of the table pretty much all season, is probably the single highest quality game of Premier League football that I have ever seen, and Fernandinho was without doubt the man of the match. In total, he spent 8 years in England and 16 years in Europe, and he is still going strong now at the age of 38, back at his boyhood club Atletico Paranaense. Fernandinho's longevity is virtually unrivaled in this 7, having made over 800 club appearances, and he has played far more games since 2000 than any other player in this 7. All things considered, he had to feature, and it speaks to the calibre of the players up next that he only takes 6th. 5th, Claude Mele. Whilst it is difficult to say for certain whether some players are actually defensive midfielders, that certainly isn't the case with either Fernandinho or especially Claude Mele. One thing that I feel compelled to clarify just to begin with, because I see it repeated so often here in England, Claude Mele did not invent the role of a holding midfielder who sits in front of a back 4. It became known, exclusively in England it should be said, as the Makelele role, because 4-4-2 was so ubiquitous in the Premier League when he arrived, and Makelele's effectiveness there under Jose Mourinho was iconic. So that is not to downplay Makelele's talents or accomplishments, it is just to say that defensive midfielders existed over 100 years ago, and it is a bit of a bizarre misconception that seems to have taken hold in some quarters. Makelele was born in Kinshasa, in what was then Zaire, but grew up in France from the age of 4 and began his professional career with Nantes, where he became a full French international. Moves to Marseille and Celta Vigo followed, before Makelele became the least glamorous, but perhaps the most important, of Real Madrid's Galacticos. Zinedine Zidane is famously quoted as having asked, quote, "Why put another layer of gold paint on the Bentley when you are losing the entire engine?" when Madrid sold Makelele to Chelsea in 2003, and it proved to be a reasonable assessment. Makelele was outstanding in the English capital, as important as any of Chelsea's back 4, as they conceded only 15 league goals during the 2004-05 season, before spending his last few years at Paris Saint-Germain. The first 9 years of Makelele's career, pre-2000, are entirely irrelevant to this 7, which prevents him from ever troubling our top 3, but he was one of the game's greatest destroyers and defensive shields who played his best football in the 2000s, and therefore, he deservedly features in 5th. 4th, Jabbi Alonzo. I will refrain from calling Jabbi Alonzo the best midfielder to play for Liverpool during the 2000s, through fear of having my windows bricked and my house pelted with dog turds by Liverpool fans, but you could certainly make a case for it. Phenomenal at almost everything that he did, Alonso could sit deep given his ability to read the game and willingness to put in a tackle, but he was gifted, inventive, and incisive when in possession of the ball and playing slightly further forward. He also had the occasional worldie in which, is always fun. A Basque native who made 5 appearances for the unofficial Basque Country national team, alongside his 114 caps for Spain, Alonso began his career with Real Sociedad before joining Liverpool in 2004. Following 5 seasons at Anfield, the first of which resulted in one of the most extraordinary Champions League wins of all time, Alonso made a £30 million move to Real Madrid. At the Bernabeu, Alonso scaled yet new heights, and in his final season with the club, he won a second Champions League. 3 seasons at Bayern Munich followed before Alonso bowed out in 2017 as still an elite-level player at the age of 35. The fact that Alonso won 114 caps for Spain in holding midfield during an era of almost unrivaled competition in his position speaks volumes about his talent and the regard that he was held in by almost everyone in the game. Combine that with the fact that his entire career came post-2000 and was spent playing almost exclusively elite-level football, and his inclusion in this 7 was never in any doubt. It was just a matter of placement. Third, Patrick Vieira. Probably the best player in this 7, in my eyes at least. There are 2 points to address right off the bat in regards to Patrick Vieira. Firstly, he is one of those players whose status as a defensive midfielder is up for debate, having been a box-to-box player who was as important on the ball as he was off it, and secondly, his age, and when he played his football as a result. In regards to the first, it was a pretty close call for me. But as we are only interested in his post-2000 performances, and he did drop deeper as the years went on, I think that it is about right. As for the second, well, Vieira began his career in 1993, which means he has a whole 7 years of irrelevant performances in the context of this 7. Naturally, that counts against him, and were that not the case, he may well have featured even higher. But the quality and quantity of Vieira's performances post-2000 still merit a spot in third. One of several outstanding French footballers to make their name with Cannes, Vieira didn't spend long in the Côte d'Azur before he was snapped up by AC Milan. In a star-studded Milan team, Vieira struggled for first-team opportunities, and after playing just 2 league games for the club, the Italian giants foolishly sold him to Arsenal. Vieira went on to become one of the Premier League's greatest ever signings, captains, and indeed players in North London. A born leader, whose long legs were equally effective in dispossessing opponents from seemingly impossible angles on the slide, and in driving Arsenal up the pitch and providing a springboard for their attacks, Vieira is perhaps the Premier League's greatest ever midfield all-rounder. Vieira also won over 100 caps for France, and after leaving Arsenal, he won a trio of Scudettos and a first Champions League with Inter Milan, in addition to enjoying brief stints with Juventus and Manchester City. Age prevents Vieira from ever mounting a serious challenge for top spot, but a podium place given the circumstances is a reflection of his ability, consistency, and performances throughout the 11 years of the 2000s that he played in. Second, Casemiro. I must admit, I went back and forth on this one a couple of times, and I suspect that there will be some backlash, but all things considered, I think Casemiro deserves to be considered the second best defensive midfielder of the 21st century. That might seem like a bold claim for someone who is still starring for a European giant now, and is only 31 years old, but I think that Casemiro can back it up. For a start, Casemiro has already played 564 games at club level and has won 73 caps for Brazil, so whilst hopefully there will be many more to come, he already has many more appearances within the relevant time period than Kante, Makelele or Vieira. Though he broke into the Sao Paulo team at the age of only 18, Casemiro has played the vast majority of his football for Real Madrid, where he was as important as Toni Kroos and Luka Modric for almost a decade in what was for a long time the best midfield trio on the planet. Casemiro racked up more than 300 appearances in Madrid, where he won the UEFA Champions League 5 times, in addition to 13 other trophies. In the summer of 2022, Casemiro joined Manchester United, commanding a potential £70 million transfer fee, even at the age of 30. And I think that since making that move, a lot of English football fans have come to appreciate that Casemiro is much more than the mere destroyer that he was sometimes portrayed as being in Madrid. Obviously incredibly strong, athletic and powerful in the tackle, Casemiro also has first-class defensive instincts, combined with the ability to pick a pass and even pop up with an all-important goal. Casemiro's performance levels over the past decade have been freakish, consistently ranking as one of the best defence midfielders on the planet, and for that reason, he takes second. 0. Honourable mentions. I must admit, this was probably the toughest 7 yet, and you don't realise until you actually spend, well, about 5 hours looking into it and drawing up a shortlist just how many incredible defence midfielders there have been over the last 23 years. Sami Khedira, for example, never even came close to featuring, but was a phenomenal footballer. The same goes for Michael Carrick, Marcus Senna, Owen Hargreaves, Nigel de Jong, Gareth Barry, Arturo Vidal, and John Obi Mikel. The likes of Rodri and Joshua Kimmich, it should be said, missed out by virtue of just not quite having played enough football yet, though I would imagine that Rodri in particular would dislodge Kante in my eyes at least, before too long. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Roy Keane and Edgar Davids are simply too old to feature, Keane having retired from football entirely in 2006, and Davids having left Inter Milan in 2005, though both were still outstanding in the early 2000s, and therefore deserving of acknowledgement. Elsewhere, Gilberto Silva, Gennaro Gattuso, Javier Mascherano, Daniele De Rossi, Esteban Cambiasso, Michael Essien, and Fabinho would all make some people's sevens, I'm sure, and all came close to featuring in mine. And a special mention, last but not least, must go to Theodoros Zagorakis, who perhaps gave the greatest defensive midfield performance at a major tournament of any player during the last 23 years in Greece's heroic Euro 2004 conquest. Those are the honourable mentions, but there is still time, of course, for the by now somewhat probably quite predictable top spot. First, Sergio Busquets. The perfect pivot in the perfect team this millennium. Ultimately, there is no way in which Sergio Busquets couldn't take top spot. Overshadowed for so long by Xavi and Iniesta, it seemed to take an awfully long time for Sergio Busquets to be properly appreciated. Neither a destroyer like Makelele or even Casemiro, nor a deep-lying playmaker spraying out long balls like Pirlo or Alonso, Busquets was quieter in his dispossessing of opponents, typically with interceptions or by cleanly taking the ball off them, both made possible by his supreme defensive positioning and understanding of the game, and in possession, Busquets was just freakishly efficient. The great players do in one touch what a good player does in two, or an average player in three. And Busquets is among the most economical footballers in possession that the game has ever seen. Not always immediately noticeable, the impact that it had upon a fantastic Barcelona team in terms of how it allowed them to control the tempo of games and then switch up that tempo whenever they wanted was absolutely enormous. Cruyff described Busquets as being, quote, like a veteran with or without the ball, when he first broke into the Barcelona team as a 20-year-old under Pep Guardiola. Busquets went on to make over 700 appearances at the Camp Nou, where he won an incredible 32 trophies in 15 seasons. At international level, Busquets won 143 caps, which is more than either Xavi or Iniesta, winning the World Cup in 2010 and the Euros in 2012. Age 35, Busquets recently joined Lionel Messi and Jordi Alba at Inter Miami. He is one of the greatest pivots of all time who has played exclusively this millennium, and therefore, he quite comfortably takes top spot. That is it for today's 7, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel and my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screen now, along with a couple of other videos from this series. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads by the username at HITC Sevens on all three, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below.